When I bought my new house, I thought my life would finally settle down. After years of hard work and effort, I bought an old but beautiful house in a quiet suburb. My house had 2 floors, with a large basement and spacious rooms, each with large windows overlooking the yard. The only problem was that it needed renovation. But I was eager. I wanted to make this house a place of peace. From the very first day, strange things began to happen in the house. As the renovation workers were peeling off the old wallpaper, one of them called out to me, "Come and look here." I approached and saw on one of the walls, under the layers of old paper, strange, jumbled lines were written, "Don't forget us." At first, I thought that perhaps the writings belonged to a child who had lived in this house many years ago, but a strange sense of unease took root in me. The workers continued their work, and I tried to ignore it. A few weeks later, when the renovation reached the basement, an even more terrifying truth emerged. One of the workers noticed something unusual while removing a brick wall. "There's something in the wall here." We broke through part of the wall with heavy tools, and a strong stench came out. At first, we thought that an animal might have been trapped and died inside. But when the dust settled, what was inside the wall terrified us all. Wooden boxes carefully hidden inside the wall. We took out one of the boxes and opened it. Inside was a large padlock, along with several tufts of human hair and pieces of torn clothing. In the next box, we found something even more terrifying: pieces of human bone and teeth. Panic gripped my entire being. Calling the police was the only thing I could think of. A few hours later, the officers arrived and began their investigation. The house was completely gutted, and every box inside the walls was examined. The police investigation was terrifyingly terrifying. For decades, the house had belonged to a man who later turned out to be a serial killer. He would bring his victims home, kill them, and hide their remains inside the walls. Years had passed, but no one had ever discovered the truth, until the day I broke through its walls. After this horrific discovery, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. There was something inside that spoke to me, whispers that would whisper in my ears at night. The police found the remains of several people, but the true number of victims was never determined. I sold the house and left forever, but some nights, when I go to sleep, I still hear the whispers of those victims, left in the darkness of the walls. We bought an old house, with a large yard and mossy walls that gave it a special beauty. When we entered the house, everything seemed to be in its place, as if no one had left the house. The house was probably 70 or 80 years old, but the space and the high walls and the old windows had a strange feeling. It even seemed like every corner of the house had a story to tell. We spent the first few days examining the furniture and decided to move it. But after a while, we realized that something strange was happening in the house. At night, when we were sleeping, we would hear the sound of soft footsteps from upstairs. It was a familiar yet unnatural sound from something more than the wind. Sometimes the doors that should have been closed would open and close on their own. At first, we thought there might be something wrong with the structure of the house, or maybe it was just an illusion of our tired minds. But as the days passed, the sounds became more frequent and seemed more like an illusion. One night, when we heard footsteps again, I decided to go upstairs. When I went upstairs, everything was quiet. Nothing was moving. But as I was walking back to my room, I noticed an old framed photo on the table in the hallway. It showed an old, broken-down family standing in front of a house that looked like the one we had bought. For a moment, it seemed as if one of the people in the photo was looking at me meaningfully. A few days later, while my wife was moving things around in the living room, she noticed that one of the doors in the room had suddenly swung open completely. She told me this, and I went back to look for an explanation. Normally, Doors in a house were supposed to be locked and no outside force could open them. After further research into the history of the house, I learned that the previous owner, Mr. Jason, had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. No one knew exactly what had happened to him. Some said that he had suddenly gone on a long journey, but no one had seen him since. One night, while I was sleeping soundly, I heard a loud knock on my bedroom door. I got up and looked at the door in fear, but I saw nothing. Only the trees in the yard rustled in the wind. But when I returned to bed, I noticed that there was a layer of dust on it, just like before. I felt that this dust was not from us, but from the presence of someone in the house. It was as if there was someone in this house, someone who never wanted to leave. We began to search the house. We checked every corner from the basement to the attic, but we found nothing unusual. It was as if the house had become completely silent and lifeless before our eyes. But at night, when everything was quiet, I could still hear footsteps. A faint sound as if someone was walking in the hallway or hiding in the corner of the room. These sounds grew louder every night, and sometimes a quiet, dead voice would come from inside the house, as if whispering in my ear. I never left. I could never fully explain it. Perhaps this house held a hidden truth, or perhaps Mr. Jason himself still lived in it, something we could not understand. We still live in this house, and every night, in a silence that seemed to come from another world, we hear the sound of footsteps and doors opening and closing on their own. Perhaps the truth is that the previous owner never left. When I bought the house, I thought I had won a great deal. The price was unusually low compared to other houses in the area, but I put it down to luck. The seller was a nervous old man who seemed to just want to get rid of the house as soon as possible. His hands were even shaking when he signed a contract. At that time, I thought that maybe he was in financial trouble and I didn't want to miss the opportunity. The house was a two-story building with a large yard and old trees. From the outside, everything looked great, but from the first day, something inside made me feel uneasy. There was a musty smell in the air, and sometimes a faint sound came from the corner of the building. However, I attributed it to the dilapidation of the house. A few weeks after moving in, I noticed that my neighbors were avoiding me. Every time I tried to talk to someone, I was met with strange, suspicious looks. The old woman who lived next door finally said quietly one afternoon, "You shouldn't live here. No one should." But before she could explain further, she closed the door. My curiosity was piqued, and I began researching the house's history. A search of the property records revealed a horrifying truth. All of the previous owners of the house had either been brutally murdered or disappeared. No one had lived in the house for more than 2 years. Some of the residents had been found dead inside, but others had vanished forever as if they had never existed. The night I discovered this information, something strange happened. It was around 2 a.m. when I was awakened by a whisper, a soft voice that seemed to be right next to my ear. The house was dark, with only the faint moonlight shining through the windows. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself that I was dreaming. But suddenly I heard the sound of a door closing from downstairs. My heart raced. I picked up my phone and turned on its flashlight. As I descended the stairs, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, but I was sure I had locked it before I went to sleep. I closed the door in fear and checked the lock again. Just as I was about to head back to my room, I heard another sound from the basement, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I held my breath. I had never been to the basement before, but now I couldn't ignore the sounds. I walked slowly to the basement door and reached for the handle. It was cold as if no one had touched it for a long time. When I opened the door, the old wooden steps descended into darkness. I held the flashlight of my phone forward and slowly descended. The smell of dampness and damp earth filled the air. Old shells and boxes filled with old things were scattered here and there. But what made my blood run cold were the paintings on the walls. The walls were covered in red stains, and among them, there were names written. As I walked further, I realized that these names belonged to the previous owners of the house. The last name was written in fresher letters than the others, my name. My body froze. This meant that someone was here, someone who knew my name. My flashlight fell to the floor, and its light fell on a corner of the basement I had never seen before. A small wooden door that looked like it had been locked for years. I grabbed the handle and turned it slowly. It opened strangely, as if it was waiting for someone to open it. Behind that door was a narrow, dark corridor. The stone walls and dirt-covered floor showed that this was not part of the original structure of the house but had been added later. I took a deep breath and walked forward. At the end of the hallway, I came to a small room. On the walls were photographs of all the people who had once lived in this house. In the center of the wall was an old, broken mirror in which I saw my reflection. But behind me, a shadow stood. I turned around in horror, but I saw nothing. My heart was beating wildly. I could not stay here any longer. I ran out of the basement, locked the door, and left the house that night. The next morning, I called the police, but when the officers entered the house, they found no trace of the hallway or the secret room. They just looked at me and said, "Maybe you're just dreaming out of exhaustion." But I knew that what I saw was real. I know this house hides something that shouldn't be discovered. I sold it, but I still hear the same whisper at night in my dreams. You are part of this house too. Sooner or later, you will return. When I found a large, beautiful house at an incredible price, I thought I had finally found my luck. After a divorce and years of loneliness, I was looking for a fresh start, and this house, with its white walls and large garden, seemed like just what I needed. The seller was an elderly man who insisted on closing the deal as soon as possible. His haste was strange, but the low price of the house dispelled all my doubts. The first day I moved in, everything was normal. Although the house smelled a little damp and some of the doors were difficult to open and close, what made me a little worried was the strange silence in the house. It was too quiet here, as if something was waiting to wake up. A few days later, strange rustling sounds came from the walls at night. At first, I thought mice had nested in the walls, but when I woke up in the middle of the night and saw that all the kitchen cabinets had been opened, my heart sank. I lived alone and was sure I had tidied up everything before I went to bed. I decided to do some research on the house's past. I went to the real estate office, and when I mentioned the house's name, the clerk at the desk paused for a moment. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "Are you sure you want to live here?" At my urging, she pulled an old file out of a drawer. As I flipped through the pages, I discovered that the house had previously been home to 3 different families, all of whom had either been brutally murdered or disappeared without a trace. The last owner, a woman named Elizabeth, was the only resident of the house and had committed suicide in the bathroom. Locals said she kept talking about eyes watching her. I left the office in a panic and returned home. I had to decide whether to leave or stay. But something inside me told me that this house still held more secrets. The next night, I was sitting in the living room when the lights suddenly went out. I picked up my phone to use its flashlight to scan the area, but before I could press the button, a shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. My breath caught in my chest. At first, I thought I must be dreaming, but when the shadow moved and a muffled moan echoed through the air, fear gripped me. Without waiting any longer, I ran to the door, but it was locked. It was as if the house didn't want to let me go. When morning came, I hurriedly packed my things and was about to leave the house. But before I could leave, I felt the need to go down to the basement once more. a place that always made me feel uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the cold stairs. My heart beat faster with each step. In one corner of the basement, the floorboards seemed to be loose. I hesitantly pushed one aside and gasped. In the basement, there was a small, secret room. Its walls were covered with strange writing. "Forget us not." In the center of the room was a wooden box. My hands trembled, but curiosity outweighed my fear. I opened the box, and what I saw inside was forever etched in my mind. Photographs of families who had lived here before, along with notes that seemed to have been written by Elizabeth. "Something is in this house. It sees me. It wants me. I'm next." I hurried out of the basement and out of the house without a moment's hesitation. Standing on the street, I looked up at the house I had once dreamed of. Suddenly, a shadow appeared from the bedroom window, watching me. I didn't wait any longer. I threw the keys inside and left the house forever. But sometimes at night, I still feel like something is watching me.